This is my self-reflection for the class of GSW Honors. So I began making this before I read the project assignment, so the first half of the presentation until about slide 10 I'm only going to go briefly over. And also because reciting what I've already written down on the slide is a bit repetitive and boring, I'm not going to recite all of it. I also try to add a bit of humor so it won't be totally unbearable. And let's begin. I was never a great writer to begin with. In high school, my teachers always made comments about how my writing was very string of thought, like I was talking instead of writing, which sometimes resulted in it being too personal and not analytical like a paper should be. This produced a lot of fear for taking a writing class in college, which I'm already a very stressful and scared person to begin with, so it was pretty bad. I tend to worry about what people are going to say about me. I'm going to be judged. Do I really fit into the honor society? Am I smart enough? Those kind of questions, which I'm sure lots of other people have as well. I was very upset after the first paper because I got a C on it. I cried silently in the bathroom because of it. Yeah, that was kind of lame and a very extreme reaction. I will talk more about it later in this paper presentation when I argue why I met course requirements, and if I even did. I really hate arguing, a lot, especially if I have to argue if I was good enough to pass a class. The multiple source essay went a lot better than the first one. I actually got an A on it and kept in mind who I was writing to, as in who my audience was. The only problem I seemed to continuously have was developing my points in counter-argument and rebuttal, basically expanding on everything. I tend not to expand because even when I'm writing out my basic points, I go beyond the page limit, which stresses me out a lot when I have to cut off 3 pages. The research proposal was probably the easiest paper I've ever had to write, most likely because it was like a reflection, and I could use the word I, and I could plan out all the thoughts that are circling around in my mind. I was very happy with the score I received on it, and it certainly did make the research paper a lot easier to write. The research paper was pretty easy to write out because all the research and rewriting I did. I also wrote about art, which I was way more interested in than relaxation techniques. I put a lot of effort into my first draft to make sure that I would do good on the final, but as I said again, I'll talk more about that later on, or you could read off the slide because I wrote a lot more on there than I'm actually saying. As I mentioned before, this entire class was focused on relaxation techniques. I wasn't too thrilled with the topic at first because people always say things to me like, "Tara, you need to be more relaxed," or "Tara, calm yourself down," and I'm just like, I just can't do that. Stress is part of my life, and I struggle with getting it to go away a lot. I did appreciate the techniques that we did, such as stretching, listening to music, or just sitting and breathing. I didn't like aromatherapy. It gave me a headache. I don't know why, but it seems I can only relax when I smell smells like clean laundry or fresh air. Breathwork techniques we did made me realize my lungs cannot hold a lot of air. Is this because I don't talk a lot and I don't need to keep taking in more air? Possibly. I will have to continue working on my breathing because it was so shaky and rough when I breathed both in and out that it kind of scared me. I only really like the stretching techniques because Now I'm going to go on to the actual paper where it's going to be boring because I'm going to read each slide to you entirely, like everything on it. If you get bored, just tone out my voice and enjoy the relaxing piano music in the background. Maybe draw or doodle something, do some stretches, search on Tumblr or Pinterest for funny cat pictures while you listen to the droning sound of my voice. Throughout the GSW course, I have learned many things from the papers we have written. Some of these items have been on how to keep in mind that who the audience for the paper is, how to separate all my thoughts into different paragraphs, how to introduce and give recognition to those who have written the resources I am utilizing for my report, and how to analyze and expand on my thoughts correctly. I have also learned a lot about the topic of relaxation, since all of our papers have been based around this. And from the knowledge that I have gained throughout this course, I believe that I have met the requirements for the GSW class with the assistance of the feedback that was provided to me with the progression through each paper. For the first paper assigned to us, the critique, in the course, I performed very badly on it. This is because of my use of transition sentences, lack of organization, and weak rebuttal and counter-argument. My teacher pointed out that one of my transition sentences in my paper was very weak. I skipped from one point to another because I had trouble connecting the two together. When I was in high school, I also had problems with transitioning between points. My inability to transition well led to my lack of separating my points into different paragraphs. This is my attempt at transitioning. Did it work very well? In my mind, I separate my papers into an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. I tend not to put the points I made in my body into their own paragraphs because of my writing process, which is very stream of thought-like. This showed in my critique when my teacher commented on my lack of separate paragraphs. Wait a second, so all three of your points are in one paragraph? I want to see each point in its own paragraph, and I want to see each of those paragraphs to be well organized and developed. This comment hit me hard because I tend to lean towards not having that many paragraphs because I can't picture how my body works well together when it is in separate paragraphs. Another fault my writing brought up in this comment was my lack of my development of my points, which also showed in my counter-argument and rebuttal. I like this transition better than the first one. When I was in high school, I never learned about what a counter-argument or a rebuttal was, so I had to try and learn how to write one based on the resources we were given, which resulted in failure. Since this was the first paper used to evaluate the skills we already had and didn't have to submit a draft, I failed miserably on it, which made me very worried for the next paper and how I would improve my writing in it. From the depression I gained from the first paper, I cried a lot because I'm a loser, came determination to improve my writing skills in the next one. The next essay I had to write was the multiple source essay, in which we had to connect quotes from different sources together. This was another new topic for me to learn, but I had a pretty easy time finding points that connected together, which resulted in me receiving a higher grade on this paper than the last one. Even though I got a higher grade on this paper than the last one, I still ended up with comments similar to the earlier ones about my rebuttal and ability to expand on my points with separate paragraphs. And the only point I really did improve on in this paper was my appeal to the audience, great audience appeal throughout the essay. Even though I improved on this part, I was very disappointed I still hadn't got the rebuttal part of a paper down yet. One of my excuses, which I probably shouldn't make, for not having a more developed rebuttal in paragraphs is that I feel very constrained by the number of pages I am allowed to write for each paper. For this reflection, I feel very free with how much I can write. I shouldn't make these remarks though, instead focus on figuring out how I can develop my points enough within a limited number of words. The comment I made in the paragraph before this is expanded on by my teacher's comment that my rebuttal glosses over the issues without really explaining how flexibility is fixed or how to deal with loud hallways, but there is a rebuttal that does address the concerns in the counter-argument. Within writing this paper, I did improve my skills in one area of the outcomes that are supposed to be made for this course. I was able to construct a paper that appeals to an audience throughout the entire length of it. All of these skills that I gained from these two papers, I was easily able to incorporate into the next one. The next paper I had to write was the research proposal, which was very different from the first two papers for the course. And the easiest. I would like to thank this paper for allowing me to feel better about myself. This paper was the easiest to write because there was a sample given to us, and it didn't require much analyzing and drilling out of thoughts, as in it didn't require the skills I was failing at. I rely on examples a lot when typing papers because I like the guidelines, but someday I would like to be able to write a paper without any assistance. The guidelines made me able to meet the requirements of planning out my research paper and finding good examples of synthesis, which wasn't difficult to do since most of art therapists all agree with each other about digital art therapy. What the guideline didn't aid me in doing was planning out my own paper based on the topic I picked. The ability to pick our topics made the research paper easy to complete for me because I was actually interested in the topic at hand. Since this paper was different in being able to pick our own topic and in how it was written, I scored a lot higher in it than on the first one. The only thing is, with this paper it was hard to see if my skills in writing improved any at all because it was different in structure. The only improvement that I could see was that I got better at introducing and giving credit to resources I picked for my final paper. The real final test to see if I improved any at all was with the research paper. The research paper, which I have not received a grade back on yet, was fairly easy to write because of the outlines I was provided with to base my paper off of, the fact that I had a lot of resources that agreed with each other, and that I was interested in the topic at hand. Since my final draft of my research paper has not been graded yet, I will be basing all of my points I make in this paragraph off of what was commented on in my first draft, which was not too much different from my final one. I still made the same mistakes I was making in the critique, such as not separating my points into paragraphs and developing the points out in them enough. However, I did improve my counter-argument and rebuttal a lot, and I am super pleased with how analytical and developed this counter-argument is. This thrilled me that I finally developed my paragraphs enough while keeping it within the page limit. Then again, I did have to go over the page limit to fix a point I had made in one of my intro paragraphs. There wasn't much else bad said about my paper, though I had questions about citing a source. Throughout the course of writing this paper, compared to the first three, this one was probably one of the easiest because of what I had learned from the feedback from the first three papers. Because of my improvement in my writing skills over the course of the essays we had to write, I believe I did meet the course requirements. The course requirements that were typed out and given to us on the first day of class were titled Formulate, Construct, Analyze, Utilize, and Demonstrate. The requirement called Formulate involved gathering research for the class essays. This wasn't called into play at first because all of our resources were given to us, although we did have to require the skill to see if a resource was fit enough to be used in the paper. I already knew choosing a good source involved it being recently published and having not been found in Wikipedia. However, I did learn that Wikipedia could be used to lead to other sources to utilize. And I also found out that not all sources had to be research papers. They can be film, blogs, images, and more. I took advantage of this fact and found several blogs and documentaries for my final paper, along with some art therapy photos. I regret using 2 documentaries because it was difficult to continuously pause and write down exactly what each person was saying in the video, though I enjoyed watching them. One of the other difficulties I had was figuring out if the paper was written in the correct way, with not too much bias. When I read scholarly articles, I tend to automatically assume that they are good to use in my paper. This critique helped me learn a lot. The critique helped me learn a lot about deciding if a source was good enough. My peers assisted me in understanding points that I had missed out about in an author's paper. Once I figured out how to pick credible sources, I moved on to using them in my first paper for the next GSW course requirement, Construct. Trying to meet the requirement of Construct was one of the most difficult problems I had in this course. All the critical comments on my paper about keeping the audience in mind, being open in a counter-argument and rebuttal, and developing my points. After the first paper, I improved upon keeping the audience recognizable throughout the entire paper and not just in the introduction, and found it easy to keep them in mind. The troubles I had continuously were developing my main points, counter-argument, and rebuttal. I tend to just get the basic idea down and expect people to understand what it is I'm trying to say, which is a bad habit of mine. From the critique onto the research paper, the comments on my paper showed that I was at least somewhat improving my ability to develop my points. In the research essay, I only had one point that I hadn't developed enough compared to the critique where everything was weak. This slight improvement shows that I did meet the course requirements because I learned from my mistakes, improved my writing. This last course requirement follows closely with the next, which is Analyze. As I said before, from reading the comments on my paper, I understood that I slightly improved my skills in developing my paragraphs. I tried my best to put out the best possible draft to be reviewed for lots of feedback so that I could make my final draft perfect. This was, in a sense, my strategy for writing. Develop and submit the best rough draft possible, then revise it to be an even better from the feedback given to me, whether it be in person or in writing. Other than that, I found finding good sources to be easy by using the library, internet, and academic search site. So I don't have much to say about this requirement that wasn't previously mentioned on it from the previous paragraph. The fourth learning outcome that I was required to attempt to meet was called Utilize. This outcome included exploring different academic topics and making sure my grammar and punctuation was correct. The only time I really got to explore a different topic was in the final two papers, where I got to choose to write about art therapy in both the traditional and digital arts. I didn't really like the constraint we had on what topics we had to write about for all the papers, which caused my lack of interest in them. One of the best techniques in my paper that I am actually pretty good at is the MLA format. I take pride in being able to cite quotes correctly. I would also like to say that there were not too many comments on my punctuation and grammar, except for repeating the same word twice in a sentence and using semicolons, which I really hate using. Also, sorry about all the parentheses in this paper. I really like using parentheses, if you could not tell. I feel as though I met this outcome pretty well, except for some small mistakes. The final learning outcome was called Demonstrate. This outcome is basically representative of how well my final essays come out, which I discussed above by citing comments made on my paper. Over time, I improved this ability. I believe I learned a lot in this class about learning to develop my ideas, and that the purpose of a class is to teach students to improve themselves. This is a summary of why I believe I met the course requirements for the GSW class. From above, I understand from comments on my final paper that there are still techniques that I can improve upon. From now on, I plan to make a new paragraph with each new topic or point I introduce, no matter how uneasy it makes me feel or how complicated and split up my body paragraph of my paper becomes. I also plan to look back at the comments I made on these papers when I'm writing others for other classes, as a reference and reminder. I also keep in the back of my head that people will not understand the points I make unless I stretch them out, and I will not feel constrained by the number of pages my paper is limited to being. Another tip I will keep in the back of my mind is that I need to connect with an audience, not just write to myself. My papers in high school were sometimes a reflection or jumble of all the thoughts that were going on in my head, which is probably why I didn't do terribly well on them sometimes. Since just keeping these thoughts in the back of my mind will not always mean I remember to focus on them, I will try a strategy of writing out all of these tips on a piece of paper and making them into a checklist to follow when writing a paper for a class in the future. I hope you had fun listening in and reading this PowerPoint presentation and enjoyed the music, which is the song Reflection from Mulan. Haha, get it? Reflection, because this is a reflection? No, too much? Sorry. I also hope you enjoyed my somewhat funny comments within the presentation. I tried to keep it as professional as I could, but I wanted some humor in it to lighten up my day and hope it made it easier to get through all of this typing for you. And I also apologize for the narrative because I messed up a few times and my throat's getting really sore because I don't tend to talk this much aloud, which is why that happened. And I hope you all have a lovely day and the rest of your life.